Hey, did you ever watch Bill Whittle now and think to yourself, man, I've got a question that can stump him? Well, now's your chance. Strata Cruise 2020, link is in the description below.
The Supreme Court sees a homeless man sleeping on the sidewalk and lets him lie. Hi, this is Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, the Supreme Court of the United States, SCOTUS as they call it, has decided not to take up a case that has already been through the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals about an ordinance in Boise, Idaho, that imposed a criminal penalty, a small fine of $25 to $75 to people who were sleeping in public spaces on the sidewalk, for example. And this is an interesting case, Bill, because in essence, by the Supreme Court not taking action on it, it could be taken by some to imply that you have a constitutional right to sleep on the sidewalk. Just on the face of it at that point, Bill, what do you think of such a constitutional right?
Well, if that is a constitutional right, then we are seeing more constitutionalists in Los Angeles than I've ever seen anywhere in one place in my entire lifetime.
So this is, it's interesting because there was this ordinance in Boise, and this case, some advocates for the homeless began to adjudicate this case or press this case. And in 2014, Boise City Council decided to order the police not to enforce the ordinance. However, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decided to rule on it anyway. And so,
imagine
it advanced. I mean, let me ask you your opinion of that. Why would a federal district court decide to rule on an ordinance that was no longer effective in a place like Boise, Idaho?
Because they're West Coast district, and they cover California, Oregon, and Washington, I believe. And there is never. I'm sorry.
I said, indeed they do.
Yes, indeed they do. And never has there been a more wretched hive of scum and busybodies anywhere on the face of the earth. If there's one thing that Californians are still leading the world in, it's telling other people what their business should be. I think in that regard, I can safely say I live in the greatest state in the nation.
Well, Bill, wouldn't this be an example, at least before they decided to stop enforcing it? This local ordinance was an example of government telling other people what they should do, getting involved in their lives, being busybodies, as you say. So isn't it a good thing that the federal court stepped in and basically said to municipalities, hey, you don't have the right to tell people what to do. If they want to sleep on the sidewalk, that's their privilege.
It's not that I'm out of words, it's just I'm trying to think this thing through. Certainly, we're dealing with public spaces. I don't suppose anybody's arguing that you have a right to sleep on private property, so we'll just put that aside. Then the question becomes, what rights do you have in a public space? Do you have a right to sleep there? You could argue that since it is a public space and you're doing anything you want to, so long as you're not breaking the law, then you're entitled to sleep there. And so by not having the law enforced or in place, you're not breaking the law, therefore you can sleep in public places. And I think that's probably how it should be. Maybe on a community by community basis. I believe in making these decisions as close to the ground as possible. And if a city decides that they're going to decriminalize or not enforce laws against vagrancy and allow people to sleep on public sidewalks or in public parks or whatever the case may be, I think that's probably up to the citizens of that city, and they'll take corrective measures if they want to, and if they won't, they won't. But there's a bigger issue at stake here, a much bigger issue, and I'm going to have to go with this one very carefully because I don't want to be misunderstood on this. Most of the time, I don't care if people don't like what I say, as long as I'm clear and people are actually, if they're either happy with or angry with, I just like it to be with what I actually say, not what they think I said. So let me put this out there as clearly as I possibly can. I'm a person who's been through tremendous hardship in my life. I'm not saying that to roll out my moral bona fides, because the morality of it doesn't really, my personal experience doesn't count on the philosophy or the morality of it. But I'm saying that to say that I understand what it's like to be on the skids. I understand what it's like to be in desperate trouble that you cannot get out of. This is not me taking a position of a guy who's always had a silver spoon implanted somewhere in his body. I'm serious about this. I'm much more sympathetic to addiction, alcoholism, and things of that nature than many conservatives are, because I have been there and I have experienced it and seen it up close. So with that said, what I have come to believe about human nature, mostly through observing my own nature, is that if I am allowed to become slothful by conditions, then that's what I will do. And furthermore, if I am given an option between an easy life of relatively low reward and a difficult life of relatively high reward, I'm probably going to take the easy life as a general rule. I think this is built into every single creature on the planet. I know it's built into mammals. This idea is closely related to the idea that no organism ever eats enough that is good for them then and stops eating. If there's a food supply down, the organism will continue to eat and eat and eat and eat and eat until there's no more food left. That's why you get fat cats and bacteria multiply in jars of agar and so on and so on and so on. Now, what is at issue here is this. Is it an act of kindness to allow people to sleep on the sidewalks in the streets if by allowing that to happen, you make it easier for them to take an option that is without question causing them long-term damage and almost certainly immediate physical harm or threat? Is that a good thing to do? Is it a moral thing to do? And I don't think it is. I think that the reason that I go to work, I'd love to tell you I was different about this. I really would. But no, if I was making the same amount of money doing what I'm doing now, I would do an awful lot less of it. And I think that's probably true for most people. And if you're not one of those people, then you have my undying respect. I mean that sincerely. But this is our entire theory of people. That's why it's our theory of government. That's why it's our theory of economics. This is how people are. So I don't think you're doing anybody any favors by making it easier for them to do something that allows them to stay in a state of dependency and poverty. I don't think that helps them. I think it's harmful.
The Ninth Circuit made this ruling on the basis of the Eighth Amendment of the Constitution and its prohibition against cruel and unusual punishments. And so, in effect, saying that an ordinance that fined an individual for sleeping on the street constituted a cruel and unusual punishment when no alternative housing or shelter is available.
That's a nonsense argument.
Isn't the court in effect saying that therefore the government is required to provide alternative shelter for those people?
No. I'm not surprised. It was the Ninth Circuit Court that came up with that piece of brilliant insight?
Yes. Well, actually, they were just agreeing with the attorneys for the homeless.
Imagine my shock. Look, I'm not saying that homeless people should be fined. I'm not saying that at all. But to say that a fine is cruel and unusual punishment is absurd. It's an absurd twist.
Well, they're saying it's cruel and unusual punishment, Bill, when alternative housing is not available, when there's no shelter available.
No. There's a difference between the circumstances of the crime and the punishment for the crime. We're talking about the punishment for the crime, and the imposition of a fine is probably the oldest or second oldest form of punishment that we've had ever in the history of the human race. And to say that imposing a fine is cruel and unusual punishment is what gets you into the kind of trouble we're in today. There's a much better argument to be made about whether or not this is appropriate, whether or not it's fair, but it is certainly not cruel and unusual punishment to impose a fine on somebody. And when you decide that it is, what you've done is you've lowered the standards of cruel and unusual punishment from things like torture and sleep deprivation and food deprivation and all the rest of it down to something that you don't like, that's something that's uncomfortable.
They're saying it's cruel because essentially they're imposing a monetary penalty on somebody who's living in the streets because he doesn't have monetary means. This is like, going to Jean Valjean in Les Miserables and saying, hey, you stole bread, you owe us 50 pounds.
This is muddy thinking, okay? And it doesn't fly here. It's muddy thinking. What you're arguing is whether or not it's just to impose that fine on people. And that is a very good argument. And I think that argument holds water. But to say that the punishment is cruel and unusual is a simply ridiculous and absurd thing to say. It's absolutely stupid.
Well, it's cruel and I know because why the penalty for poverty is imposition of a financial penalty that these people can't pay. A fine
is not cruel and unusual punishment, Scott, and it's not got anything to do with whether or not they can pay it. If the IRS decided that I owed them money and they decided to fine me $5 million, I could not say that the fine is cruel and unusual punishment. I could say that I think the fine is excessive and out of proportion, but fining me is not cruel and unusual punishment. A fine is a fine is a fine. It's not cruel. There's nothing cruel about it. You can argue whether or not that punishment is appropriate to the transgression. That's a different argument. But to say that fining people is cruel and unusual is nuts. And the reason I bring up the IRS thing is, if the IRS fined me $5 million, would that be cruel and unusual? I don't have anything like $5 million. So according to this argument, it would be. What if they fined me $500,000? I don't have that either. So that would be cruel and unusual punishment too. At what point does it stop being cruel and unusual punishment? Is it when it takes all of my money or 80% of my money or 120% of my money? At what point does that fine suddenly become not cruel and unusual? At what dollar value does that happen for me?
So, Bill, I'd like to finish up with a related story that I saw today. The New York Times had kind of a photo and video essay. They spent, I think it was 3 months in an encampment in California. It was in Oakland, actually, where there's this parking lot next to a Home Depot, and I think there's a McDonald's within walking distance. And this whole area is filled with what appear to be RV homes that don't work anymore, and tents and little shacks made out of pallets and plastic and things like that. And they spent a good deal of time there. And then the city came through and said that there was a fire hazard, and they had to take a lot of stuff out of there. They took many, many tons of garbage out of this place where these American people were living. While that was happening, the New York Times sent its reporters down to a slum in Mexico City, in the country of Mexico. And they visited their slum, and you can see it in the video and the photos, the difference between the Mexico City slum and the slum in California. The Mexico City slum, by contrast, looked relatively neat. These structures had been built out of galvanized tin and bricks and stones and things that they've been able to put together. Every dwelling actually had its own lavatory, whereas the people in the United States were walking to McDonald's to use the restroom there. And it was just really striking to see the quality of life for people living in the slums in Mexico versus the United States. Do you think that the government of the United States, or that the government of individual cities has a responsibility to make sure that these people aren't living in horrendous conditions that are worse than Mexico City slums?
Yes, categorically yes. And all I would say about that is that Mexico City slums are so much nicer than ours because Mexico's had a lot more time to deal with poverty than we have. They've gotten a lot better at it. They've had a lot more practice than California.
By the way, they're also looking the other way when it comes to things like the people who live in those slums setting up their own septic systems and their own power grid and things like that.
Those are fundamentally different things, Scott. What you're talking about there is a slum. You're talking about a ghetto or a slum, and it is a permanent residence. It's not going anywhere. That's why it has some of the features of a permanent residence, like toilets and things of that nature. That slum is a fixture, and when you say people look away from it, that's because it's always going to be there, and they know it, and it probably always has been there. What we're talking about is people camping underneath every single overpass in Southern California, and furthermore, having taken the train up to Stockton. I have seen cities of tents that went by for 2.5 minutes at 40 or 50 miles an hour. I mean, absolute cities there. And this is an entirely different kind of poverty. For those of you who think that maybe I'm being awful cavalier about this and I don't care, you're wrong. I care about it. I care about it a lot, and I certainly care about it more than progressives because I'm willing to speak the truth about it rather than just say, oh, we should give them the freedom to be themselves and let them go and live their own lives. No, there is a ravine in the northern part of Los Angeles, up by Hanson Dam area. I don't know if it's still there or not, but there was a time several years ago when this ravine held a group of maybe 400 or 500 people on any given night. And people knew that you could just go down there, bring your sleeping bag if you had one or not, and just basically camp out in this city, in this homeless city. And the number of stabbings and murders and forget petty thefts, those were just not even just rampant. They were just, that's how the day went. And to say that it's a form of mercy or respect, to say, oh, who are we to say that they shouldn't be allowed to live out there in public spaces and so on, is to deny our responsibility to our own mutual well-being. I almost said community, but that word has been very badly tainted, and that's not what I mean. I'm not talking about a collective responsibility. I'm talking about your individual personal responsibility to make sure that the area that we all live in together is maintained to a standard of civilized minimums. And this particular form of civic virtue has long vanished from this state, long vanished. I don't think you would see this in places like Texas or Minnesota or anything like that. I don't think you'd see anything like it because I think the people there are just too good-hearted to allow that to continue. But in California, no, this is a predatory state filled with vipers, and they don't care about anything other than their six-figure retirement packages.
If you'd
So
like to,
it's not. So
ahead.
it is not. It is not a favor to people down there. And I know some of those people who are down there. I know the terror that they go through on a nightly basis. And there are shelters available in LA. I don't think they're particularly good places. I don't think anybody'd want to be there. I think a society as rich as ours does have a moral obligation to help people get on their feet. But getting on your feet requires the discipline to motivate people once they're living in your shelters. You've got to get them motivated. And the best way to deal with this kind of thing, the best way to deal with addiction, the best way to deal with this kind of poverty, alcoholism, all of it, the best way to deal with it is to do the exact opposite of what we're doing. We are concentrating it. We're concentrating it so that addicts are living next to addicts, surrounded by addicts who do nothing but addict things all day. The way you really solve this problem is to disperse it. And the only example I ever saw of that was when I visited Salt Lake City, and I went to was it Welfare Square, where they not only can food, distribute food, and so on, but they take individual people, Mormon or not, according to my understanding, and take them, if not into their homes, then make them their wards, and they make sure that they know how to cook beans and rice and chicken and all the rest of it. And they have a personal vested interest in a fellow citizen, which is not imposed upon them by the government, but comes out of the own virtue of their own charitable hearts. That solution actually works, and I suspect that nothing short of that solution is going to change this situation.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful for your support. If you're a member at BillWhittle.com, if you are one of our patrons over at Patreon.com/BillWhittle, we are grateful for the way you make it possible for us to do this. If you'd like to see these kinds of conversations happen live and in real time, then join us on our cruise in May of 2020. You can get full information if you click the link in the description below. And again, we are grateful to the folks over at the Patriot Post, America's News Digest, for making this possible. Continue to like and share this from our website at BillWhittle.com. And if you'd like to become a member, click that Become a Member link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching.